This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. I want to thank my latest reviewers on the Apple Podcast Store. Thank you to Free at Last 52 and for Alabama's Mommy, who I think has also done a review on podchaser.com. You too can review the podcast on the Apple Podcast Store, and now you can rate the podcast on Spotify. Subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's podcast. On to today's show. My guest today is Matt Oxley. Trying to describe Matt Oxley is nearly impossible, so I'm going to read you his Twitter bio. He, him, queer, poly, atheist, leftist minister of the gospel. Confused? Good. That pretty much sums him up. Matt has a unique perspective on Jesus and his teachings. Although Matt is an atheist, he is still interested in following Jesus' teachings. Matt is one of those early bloggers who was writing about deconstruction very, very early on. His blog is called ragingrev.com. I highly suggest that you check that out. Matt is also the co-host of the Pastor with No Answers podcast. We discuss his involvement in that podcast, and what you're going to notice is I come in a bit hot on that topic. And the reason is I had listened to an episode of Pastors with No Answers that was really specifically about people who have deconstructed, and it was definitely from a Christian point of view and definitely from the angle of they probably haven't tried God as I understand him. So I was feeling a bit sensitive. So if I come across as a bit critical there, that was the context. But this conversation with Matt is amazing. Matt has been participating in our community group, Deconversion Anonymous, on Facebook. He has led a hangout. I hope he does more there. I'm very excited to have met Matt. And here is Matt Oxley to tell his story. Matt Oxley, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
I'm really glad to be here. It's a great pleasure.
Thank you for jumping into the community and engaging me in email. Off the top, I want to just promote a couple of things that you're involved in. You have your ragingrev.com blog. You're kind of old school, man. You went through this before there were a lot of deconstruction, deconversion blogs, a lot of podcasts and things like that. And then you're also a part of the Pastor with No Answers podcast. Is that correct?
I help them with some stuff behind the scenes, and I've just become kind of a regular on the show. It's a lot of fun over there.
Awesome. Very cool. But we will begin with your story. I want to hear about, what was it like for you, your faith tradition growing up, and then we'll get to like what the doubts were and that whole process.
Yeah. Okay. Well, my faith tradition growing up was what I've always called Baptist-costal.
Okay.
Which, if you're Southern enough or Baptist enough, you know what that's just another word for kind of a mainstream Baptist with some Pentecostal flair, a little bit of speaking in tongues here and there, the good stuff like that, a little bit of extra flair and drama.
Okay.
Yeah. As you traverse the spiritual planes, I guess. But they tend to be very strict. As far as, sexual morality and just very strict as far as the inerrancy of the Bible and what cardinal doctrine is, what you must believe or must do. So those are all big components of what I grew up in. And I was probably 6 or so when I was quote unquote saved the first time. But Paul would say that is something you continually do. And I still think like a Christian. I still think in terms of Scripture kind of constantly. Yeah. I've never been able to shake that. That's kind of you'll hear me quote the Bible a lot because I'm a big Bible nerd. But I grew up and kind of this, I started off in a Pentecostal church and then kind of in my early teens was trying to find a place that felt right, and I was part of a split that formed a new church, and it was very non-denominational, very free-flowing, and
Okay.
a different thing for around here because it's a very Baptist community. There's a lot of Baptist churches here. There's like 180 churches in my community
Wow.
of 20,000 people.
Wow.
So it's like 30-to-1 ratio. It's kind of ridiculous. And then when I was 13, 14, 15 maybe in that range, I became really hardcore about my faith after attending a revival, and it just became all that I could think about, all that I could focus on.
Yeah.
So I was, I kept my purity and um, all of those important things. Didn't cuss, didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't do anything super fun. But I did go to church a lot, and I read the Bible kind of constantly,
Okay.
and I got into apologetics that way. And I think that's probably the road that led me to not believe anymore. Is apologetics forces you to research other beliefs so much that you will inevitably come to understand your own better. And I think that it helped me do that. And all the criticisms I could throw at another belief system, I recognized very quickly I could throw at my own,
Yeah.
and that kind of leads you down another path.
Yeah. I know you're new maybe to my work and stuff. I say all the time, like I love believers,
Yeah,
but I
same.
occasionally get angry at apologists.
Yeah,
And I think my advice, like atheist advice to apologists is you're hurting your people.
yeah,
I think apologetics hurts belief
yeah,
and
absolutely.
basically for the reasons that you just stated.
Yeah, I I was really interested in what cardinal doctrine was. If the Trinity has to be true, why does it have to be true,
Mm,
and why is everybody else wrong? Or anything, just pick a cardinal doctrine, and that was something that I really focused on, and that made me really understand where do these doctrines come from. They don't actually seem to be fully supported by the Bible,
yeah.
but we can see how you get there. I can see all the trails that are taken to get to a belief system, but I didn't see that in the Bible as I understood it. So that there were so many different little layers. I had a strong understanding of my beliefs that was getting stronger, but at the same time, I was learning that I didn't know much. I,
Mm,
I was realizing just how little I knew and had the capacity to know, especially at such a young age. But yeah, and then I was 19ish or so. I had already been out of the church for a few years,
hmm
and I left the church that I was with over doctrinal issues,
Okay.
and just kind of sat at the house for a while and didn't go to church. And then I found myself, I did what I called it a sabbatical, but I really stopped and examined 100% of my belief. And like the prayer at the time was, I'm willing to give you up to find the truth, and you was God. I was willing to challenge 100% of everything. And that was very scary because it was not only blasphemous to have that much doubt, but you're challenging God to prove himself to you. So
Mm.
that comes with a lot of trepidation.
I remember consciously having the thought, if my faith is worth anything, it has to stand up to scrutiny. Like this,
Right.
like the attitude with which I am, you know, digging in here or trying to find the truth is in humility. It is in a desire to find the truth, and if it can't stand up to that, the faith is the problem, not my digging.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know if you read stuff like a Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, stuff like that.
Yeah, definitely.
I always, even as a Christian who was fully convinced, I always thought that the arguments in there and in most apologetic texts were very poorly constructed
Mm,
and were flimsy, and they all relied on a certain amount of faith. You have to take X, Y, and Z and believe those things. And if I was having trouble with those things, the rest of it uh, was never going to work. So
right.
I always found that those arguments were lacking, but I was still able to maintain belief.
Yeah.
And
You're telling my story, Matt. That's
yeah,
yes.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy how much you can just see wrong in front of you and ignore it, but eventually it kind of comes to a head. I think that's what it did for me.
Mm. Were there specific things? I know that we often say it's not one thing, it's 1,000 things, but
Right.
but were there any, major milestones along the way where you thought, I just can't accept this piece of this doctrine or this idea?
I call myself a Calvinist atheist. That I don't believe that we have much free will.
Okay.
So I don't think that I realized at a certain point that I could not say I believe and be 100% honest, because
Mm-hmm.
my doubts were much bigger than my faith at the time. And there was no particular question, but um, it was the fact that I had been in this for so long. I had been engaging with this idea that God might not exist for a couple years,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't feel like God was trying to stop it.
Okay.
I didn't,
Yeah.
and
Familiar.
eventually
Yeah.
I just felt like I was out. I was empty. The faith was gone, and I couldn't refill the tank. It was not mine to get. It was not mine to give. It's just gone.
Right.
And either my view of God is higher than that of most Christians, or it's much lower. But I believe that God has to understand. At this point, God has to understand what I'm going through.
Mm.
And so I have to release these beliefs.
Yeah.
And then I just said the word out loud. I don't believe. I think I'm an atheist.
Mm.
And that was frightening and scary, and it took a couple of years to actually do.
Yeah.
But then once I did, God, all I wanted to do was tell everybody. So my
Yes.
evangelical roots came back,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I kind of became the anti-apologist. And
Yeah. Pretty common, I think. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I think that's really common. And I tend toward extremes. I've always gone for the most spiritual thing or the most secular thing. It's never going to be in the middle for me. And I'm finding the middle ground now, but I'm 35. I had to become 35 years old and have a near death experience and get divorced and all that to really understand a lot of that stuff.
So Matt, I was able to read, some of your blog, and definitely there were some things that just leapt out at me of like, wow, that's really connected with me. And I'll just a couple of quotes. One, you say it's not illogical then for a kid the age of 6 to cling to religion with the steadfastness that many adults fail to. When I found out about the story of grace, I found it irresistible. And then you talk about agape as well, and the concept of that proactive love. Obviously, grace is still a major theme for me. It was definitely. I used to say I was a grace junkie as a Christian. Like that was everything. Everything,
Yeah,
I interpreted everything within the Bible through that lens of grace, and my feeling was at the time that that's what the church was missing. Right, the church, they just didn't
right,
understand grace. They were becoming legalistic and all the things that Jesus, talked against.
right.
Now I'm on the other side trying to kind of reinterpret that a bit. But I'm curious, for you, does that word grace mean, does it have particular meaning for you?
It does. If I had been better at naming my blog, it would have been your name, because it's
Mm.
actually what I want to embody. I don't even know why I named it what I named it back then.
Yeah.
It's just I have to come up with something,
Yeah.
um, so I can spill my guts to the world.
Yeah.
Um, I find myself as a person with a lot more grace to give today. At the time, I believed grace was something given to those who chose to receive it.
Hmm.
So, the story of salvation can go a few different ways. There are a lot of doctrines surrounding soteriology, but what what I believed was that you had to accept Christ's sacrifice.
Mm.
And doing so meant that you believed X, Y, and Z. Christ is God, that hell is real, the Bible is inerrant. That all of those parts are necessary in order to make it to a proper salvation.
Mm-hmm.
To me now, looking back, that is a very anemic view of grace. If I read the Bible today, what I get out of it is that Christ came to die for 100% of mankind, and anything else is a failure
Mm.
of that mission. Um, if I read the Bible with that lens on, trying
Right,
to
right.
understand it through the eyes of grace, the grace I see now is complete and total. Um, Even though I don't really believe it, so I speak a lot as if I'm talking as a person who believes
Yeah.
the narrative, even though I don't. But I do read the Bible as a person um, who's trying to get the best out of it, the most out of it. And so that's kind of what I find myself doing a lot, is putting on the hat of a Christian and trying to interpret it that way.
I love, by the way, I saw your Twitter account and your pinned tweet is, "You are loved. This is my gospel."
Yes,
I love
yeah.
that. That's beautiful.
Well, thank you. Yeah,
Yeah, I think we've got a fair amount in common here, Matt. so,
yeah,
so yeah, I talk about a lot this concept of secular grace, and I find that people either hear that and get it almost
right.
immediately, or I really can't explain it. You know what I mean? It's this
Yeah,
idea of that even as a Christian, looking back with hindsight, it is all about the human connections. It's all about
yeah,
how we interact with each other, how we support one another, how we love one another, and and that there's no supernatural dimension to that that's necessary. I can express that. I can be that. I can receive that as just a human being.
and we have explanations for that in biology too. Like there are good reasons for us to congregate, to
Yes.
try to get along and have a central tenet that makes us get along.
Yeah.
There are good biological explanations for all of that. The creation of God as we have done it is as natural a thing as there could be. It's a part of our evolution, I
Right.
think. So anyway, sorry I interrupted.
No, I absolutely agree. To be personal for a second, I have a family member right now who's very ill and
Mm,
very likely going to die in the coming months.
mm,
And boy, I miss having, some sense of control over that. And
absolutely.
I don't
Yeah.
have it.
Yeah.
That's really, really hard. So,
Yeah, that is very hard. That's one of the many things that you will grieve as you go through this, is the ability to have any certainty. You have to let go of certainty,
yeah,
and that's kind of what God provides us, this one certain thing. You always know that this is true, so you can make it through the rest of the world. Everything else can make sense because this is true.
right.
And once you lose that, you have to really re-examine the entirety of your epistemology, and it can devastate people. I mean,
Mm.
I've certainly seen people go through some rough situations as far as losing God, losing ministry, losing family, and all that stuff. And I mean, there were certainly challenges for me as I run a small business in a small town in the deep South, and I was very public about leaving the faith. I was very public about Black Lives Matter and LGBTQ issues. I was very public when I came out as bisexual.
Mm.
I'm that type of person. I fully believe that if there's anything worth hiding in your life, you should probably stop doing that thing.
Yes.
And I don't have anything in my life I feel like I need to hide. And I never have.
Right.
I've never felt any major shame over. Well, I guess not since I left the faith. I stopped feeling the shame, and so that's the one thing that really gets better is the shame.
Yeah.
If you grew up in the type of Christianity I did, the shame is horrible, and it follows you everywhere. And any relief from that is a positive in my book.
Absolutely. Yeah. Two things to respond on that. One, just, the purity culture kind of teaches you to not be human.
Yeah.
whoever you're attracted to, whatever, your desires are, to push that down and ignore it and pretend it doesn't exist, and you're a bad person for feeling that. It's just so absurd, right?
It
Like,
is. Yeah.
and then the second thing is just, the beauty on this side of the equation is living authentically yourself. It is incredibly freeing and awesome.
Yeah. The traditional Christian narrative is that God created you and he's been pissed off ever since.
Yes.
And so, and that doesn't make any sense, you know?
Yeah.
Like I feel like I wish that I had experienced those thoughts about God without just throwing the whole thing away.
Yeah.
But because I was a fundamentalist, I couldn't conceptualize of a faith that wasn't fundamentalist.
Yeah.
So I threw the baby out with the bathwater. There was no redemption for this faith for me. And only recently have I been able to like look at it again and appreciate what I think the goal was and find real, what seems like a more abundant amount of grace. And just it looks much better from the outside than it did when I believed it.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I find that I love it more now. I love the Christianity more. I love the church more, and I care more about those people because I have a sympathy for them. I know what they believe and why they believe it, and I know where their beliefs come from, and I would really love to see the church become what Jesus was trying to create.
Mm.
I think it
Interesting.
would just be an incredible, incredible, powerful movement that unfortunately floundered really early on.
Another quote from your blog: "Modern Christianity doesn't start with Jesus; it starts with Paul, and crosses the Rubicon of repairability somewhere between 325 and 451 CE during the early church councils." My immediate question to that is Christianity redeemable? And it sounds like you've changed your mind on that over time.
I I think that what we call Christianity today is properly defined as Chalcedonian Christianity, and that was established by Chalcedon, and that is its own thing.
Yeah.
And I want to look at what happened before that. I see a much different church. I see a church with a lot of uh, a lot of traits that are common in Jewish communities of
Hmm.
faith is doubt and debate and questions and working through things and very little doctrine.
Yeah.
There's very little doctrine in the Jewish faith. It's about trying to figure out God
Hmm.
and not saying you have the answer. Um, and one of the failures of modern Christianity is that it fails to look at the New Testament with a Jewish lens. And that lens is the lens it was meant to be read in. That lens is who it was written for. And that context matters an awful lot,
Absolutely.
an awful lot. And you know, every seminary in the country is probably failing to do a good job of providing you with that lens as you go through seminary or you know, and that trickles down into all your churches
Hmm.
having a poor understanding of the faith.
Man, there's several things I want to talk about there. One is, I call myself a humanist. The
Yeah,
direction I think this may be the daylight between us is that I'm not interested in redeeming the church. I'm not. I don't. I think it's been tried 1,000 times. We have
true. Yeah,
hundreds and hundreds of different denominations, and I don't know that that's a workable process. So what
yeah,
I find valuable is just embracing our humanity and connecting to one another from that perspective. But why I bring that up is to say that I think we often hear from Christian apologists that humanism borrows everything from Christianity. And first of all, I don't think that's true. I
no,
think people were good to each other before that. But
yeah,
secondly, if anything, it borrows from Judaism, and
correct. Yeah,
particularly modern secular Judaism. That's really the foundation stones of modern humanism is modern secular Judaism.
right. And secular Judaism has its roots in religious Judaism. It's you know those egalitarian concepts are pretty universal in religion.
Mm-hmm.
it's a lot of times it's taken out of context and destroyed. Islam has a lot of egalitarian concepts and a lot of peace and love, but some people view Islam as a hateful religion full of terrorists. No, they're just people interpreting scripture in a way
Right.
that fits them and that fits their preconceived notions. And they've created God in their own image, right?
Right.
Anytime you use scripture to prove your way, you're taking God's words in your mind and making them your own. And that is, if there is any blasphemy, it's certainly that.
I recently saw a PBS show that was about written language. Basically, human beings have invented language multiple times, specifically writing. And there are amazing commonalities between the various writing systems from disparate parts of the world and disparate cultures. Mm-hmm. And the point they were making is the reason for that is that the mind creating those languages were all human. Analogously, I think religions have lots of similarities because the minds creating that under the hood are all human beings. Obviously, there's many cultural differences and the specifics might be different, but there are some core elements about being kind to one another and supporting one another financially or resource wise and caring for one another, because that's what human beings need. And we're all going to reinvent that every time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. I think back to Zoroastrianism and um, gosh, I used to know all this stuff. The Epic of Gilgamesh.
Mm.
Those are stories that have some representation. Pretty much anywhere in any religion is a massive flood of some sort.
Mm-hmm.
And because we are humans and the people that were experiencing life 10, 5, 3 to 1,000 years ago, we're all experiencing the same life as the other. We are experiencing that life now. We just have their history and their work to kind of back us up.
Mm-hmm.
But these are just human experiences written down.
Mm-hmm.
Human attempts to understand something bigger than themselves. And that's, instead of like disliking or I guess having a problem with the Bible or the Quran or any religious text, if I view it through the lens of a person who's just trying to explain the world as I understand it,
yeah,
it's a much more beautiful thing, and it makes me feel more connected to those people. I feel more connected to Islam because it is a beautiful way to try to understand the world.
right.
A big, confusing, scary world that we're in. And, I think a lot of what we attempt to do now in kind of our modern age is an attempt to understand the world or to control the world and make it fit us. So, a lot of our social media, the way we ingest information, all of that is religious in its own way. It has a lot of um, adherence, I
Yeah.
guess you could say. There are a lot of adherents to social media culture and I guess the cult of social media. And those are out of the same desires to try to understand life or control it. And I really think that that's where most of our major religions came from. And we had to tell each other sometimes to be good to one another.
Yeah.
Somebody had to write that down, unfortunately, but somebody wrote it down,
Yeah.
and a bunch of other people wrote it down too in their own way. But it was out of an observation. That guy was a dick.
Yeah.
We had to get him out of our society. Observation, I think, is what led us to all of our scripture. So it's easier to feel connected to those people who were just in a confusing world.
Absolutely. James Croft, who is the leader of the Missouri Ethical Society, recently said, everything is secular. So
Yeah.
religion is secular, and that is just a way of summarizing what you just said. That people created that. People are trying to figure out how to live in the world, how to be
Yeah.
with each other. I feel like we did this out of order, so we're going to go backwards just a little bit. The other thing that I really appreciated about your blog and your work is kind of explaining that deconversion deconstruction process as a grief process.
Yeah.
And we hinted earlier that you did this a few years ago, so that there weren't there weren't as many or as blogs and podcasts and things, and so you were kind of doing this alone. Do
Definitely.
you want
Yeah.
to talk about what that grief process was like for you, and then how you understand that?
I went through all the stages, and I went through some of them many times. But I spent the most time with anger and I guess depression
Mm-hmm.
being uh, a big part of that. The 2 years at which I was really struggling the most, I was suicidal more than I wasn't, and had planned to kill myself a number of times.
I'm sorry.
That that informs the way I approach it because I when I see someone else going through spiritual crisis or a dark night of the soul or whatever tagline you like, I think that person's going to have that crisis and not have someone. And so I don't really even know how I managed to survive it. I'm not sure why I did not kill myself, but there was a time where I finally allowed myself to say out loud that I no longer believed.
Mm-hmm.
And that alone, that acceptance part, which is one of those stages of
Yeah.
grief, allowed me to move into the next stage. Um, but I mean, I think it's just like grieving anything. The more you love your God, the harder he is to lose.
Mm-hmm.
You may not grieve necessarily an abusive parent, but you would grieve a parent you loved and who
Right.
loved you. And I didn't see my God as abusive so much as kind of my best friend and the only reliable source of information I had from a young age.
Yeah, I've talked about it as you know, you potentially lose community, you potentially
Yes.
lose family connections, you potentially lose friends, and you're losing the closest person you have ever been to. Your concept of God. That is a lot to grieve all at one time.
Yes. Yeah. It's overwhelming, and there are also the dynamics of your close relationships you have to consider. What will my wife think if I
Mm-hmm.
tell her this? So I didn't tell her for 2 years. Or your parents. We had to navigate all that stuff. You don't realize how much of your life is caught up in this faith until it starts to crumble.
Another idea that you presented in the blog is, what would Jesus do? So I think you have a really interesting perspective on Jesus, in that like you say, you're seeing it from outside of Christianity, and seeing it for what he actually said. I always cracked up about this. The "What would Jesus do" movement thing happened a little bit. I was a little older. I was still a
Yeah.
Christian, but not something that I participated in. But I always thought, well, he'd flip some tables and he'd be telling
Right.
all the leadership that they're doing it wrong,
he'd be
that they're
he'd be
hypocritical,
pissing.
and yeah, exactly, and whitewash tombs. I mean, that's what Jesus
Yeah.
would do, right? Like, that always struck me as like phenomenally unself-aware.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but so like how like what is it that you see that Jesus was trying to say that got muddled?
Well, a lot of people think that Jesus was killed because he claimed to be God. And I reject that wholly. I
Mhm.
believe Jesus was killed because he was telling people of means to give up their means. Um, and essentially, is cursing allowed
Yeah, oh
here?
yeah, absolutely.
I think he was saying, fuck the state.
Okay.
And he was saying, fuck the Roman occupying state.
Mm-hmm.
Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Give unto God what is God's. He believed that everything belonged to God,
Mm-hmm.
and only what's left of that could belong to Caesar. So he wasn't telling the disciples to pay taxes. He was telling them to fuck the state and fuck all the things you love.
Mm-hmm.
Fuck your love for money, because that keeps you away from God. And going back into uh, a Jesus that is informed by Judaism, what would that mean? Well,
Mm-hmm.
this is an egalitarian faith that believes that if you do a bad thing to your neighbor, literally you've done that to God. So you must only do good because God is in everybody. God, we are all created in the image of God, therefore we must all be treated as well as God. Anything that detracts from that or takes away from that is an abomination. That is sin. That's kind of how certain realms of Judaism would look at sin. Anything that denigrates mankind, because that's God's greatest creation. To love God is to love mankind, etc., etc., etc. And I believe Jesus knew that, understood that, and believed that, and was telling people to give up the things that took away, which is their money, their job, uh, their mortgage, and their participation in the system. And the system, in particular, at the time, was bad for anybody that wasn't Roman or that
Yeah.
did not have a lot of religious influence, or a lot of money. And I mean, we have our parallels today. Uh, we did not have capitalism in the way that we have it now, but I don't think that Jesus would have been cool with having his birthday become number one capitalist day.
It is a bit ironic, yes.
I feel like, as angry as he was in the temple, I can't imagine the white hot fever that would come out of Jesus right now to see Christmas.
Yeah.
And
In his name, yeah.
yeah, it's just ludicrous. I mean, and he'd probably be offended at all the crosses on everybody's necks too. I can't imagine he's like, just what I want to see.
Yes.
The world is very inhospitable to Jesus today, and I think it was then, and it was really just a guy trying to tell you that all the things that you own are not important. Your neighbor is.
Yeah.
I think it's that simple. And I think that's also a much harder gospel. I don't have to believe anything special about Jesus. He doesn't have to be God for me to think that, yeah, that's actually true.
Right.
But to live my life that way, in a way that doesn't exploit people, well, that's practically impossible today, but it's a very hard ask.
Yeah, easy to say, very difficult to do. Yeah.
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 You've basically described why I became a Christian. So
Yeah.
I was a bit late, kind of nominally Christian as a kid, and then in my teen years, had a commitment and salvation experience, that kind of thing. But it was, I'm here not for the well, but for the sick.
Right.
It was that message that is the thing
Yeah.
I didn't hear anywhere else, and I thought, well, that's obviously true. and, but I like the way you have distinguished. We don't have to believe something special about Jesus to acknowledge the truth of the statements.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Martin Luther King, same thing. I think he was an activist, highly informed by the tactics of Jesus.
Yeah.
But he did some things that I wouldn't agree with. Um, but I still have to appreciate his legacy. So I look at Jesus like a legacy of social activism, I guess, if you could call it anything. It's just a legacy of promoting egalitarianism in the most extreme ways.
Okay.
And in those societies, that's not welcome. It's not welcome in our society.
Right.
So.
One more thing on this topic. One of my favorite pieces of literature of all time is Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. And there's a section in there called The Grand Inquisitor. Now, Dostoevsky was Orthodox, and so there's a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment there. I'm not endorsing that at all, but the whole point was that if Jesus returned to earth, we'd crucify him all over again, right? Like,
Absolutely.
like
No question.
he would not be able to live any further than 33
Yeah.
years he did before.
No, he probably wouldn't make it to 33. I
Yeah,
I
yeah,
can't imagine.
yeah.
It wouldn't go well, and I think he would have more trouble in the church sphere than anywhere else too. He'd probably get along fine, and um, he might do fine in a non-Western culture, but he's not going to be welcome here
Yeah.
for sure.
So I know you're doing work with the Pastor with No Answers podcast, and I have to be honest. We're being authentic. I've only listened to a little bit, and I don't want to be overly critical here, but I had a pretty strong reaction, in particular to the recent episode that had a couple of guests on talking about deconstruction from a fairly progressive Christian perspective. And it may be because I am super sensitive about deconverts and people in the middle of deconstruction, but it was painful. It was painful to listen to.
Yeah.
And so the reason I bring it up, Matt, is that, having read a bit of your blog, there seems to be a difference there between what I think you stand for, or at least my understanding of that, and some of the tone of that podcast. Do you see that? Am I wrong?
Yeah. I view kind of all people as on a journey to some place,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm going to believe different things in a year than I do now.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be the case with Joey, who is the host of that
Mm-hmm.
podcast. I've been following him since he believed in hell and was pretty fundamentalist, and I've observed our friendship came out of me observing him go through mental health crises and struggle with questioning the same cardinal doctrines I did.
Yeah.
And I think, well, I guess I should delineate between deconstruction and deconversion. One is a process which leads to the other.
Yeah.
Sometimes, but not always. Not. Um, I have worked with hundreds of people in the last 12, 13, 14 years since I really started writing about it. And I've never made it a goal to like deconvert. I've never tried to like
Sure.
get people to become atheists. I don't. If that's gonna suck as bad as it did for you, as it did for me, well, I don't want you going through that.
Right.
I have always tried to help people re-examine their faith fairly, and that is the deconstruction process. Sometimes people land on a different version of the Christian faith that is just more palatable. It's more palatable to you and to me and to them, and kind of to the human condition. But other people, like myself, like you, we land a little bit further away
Yes.
and we can't believe. We're stricken with unbelief. Lord, help my unbelief. I'm sure you've prayed that. And I kind of see Joey as a guy, and the people kind of in his vicinity as a guy who is fervently seeking the truth in the same way that I was and still am, and is, you know, trying his best to express it as he gets there. And
Yeah.
I I certainly don't agree with half of what he says, but
Okay.
but I almost always agree with the spirit in which he says it,
Interesting.
because he does he means well, always, and I rarely agree with anybody on anything anyway, so I just like that.
Yeah. Well, clearly, Matt, yeah, you are a more graceful atheist than I am. I appreciate that. Thank you for letting us see inside your head on that issue. I think that the direction I want to take this is the question of how we interact with progressive Christians. So I 100% agree with you that there are better and worse versions of Christianity, and I would much rather have someone move from fundamentalism to progressive Christianity. The thing that and maybe this is just my issue, but for me, I say sometimes that the word God and or the word Christianity are two of the most misunderstood words in the English language. And so I never use those terms to describe what I'm doing because I know they will just be misunderstood. That you take 1,000 people and ask them, say God in front of them, and you could mean it as in our human connection and our goodness towards one another, and they mean it as this fundamentalist, angry deity, and there's just no way to manage that. Having said that, I'm also cognizant of attempting to redefine the word grace. I'm doing it myself, so I'm hypocritical. I guess my question to you is like, how do you balance that of being very graceful to participate as someone like Joey is going through this process and also remain clear on where you stand and what you believe?
Well, I'm not very clear on where I stand and what I believe.
Okay.
I think that's the key, and I mean I think you probably know that too. That your beliefs now are probably a lot less firm than what they were when you were a Christian,
Sure.
because they had to be right, and now they don't. They don't have to be right. If I'm wrong about the way a tadpole becomes a frog, it really doesn't matter. It's not going to hurt anything.
Yeah.
When there's not some eternal reward or punishment, the stakes go down. And because he does not have that those stakes, and I don't have those stakes, it's a lot easier to I guess meet in the middle. That's kind of what's delineating progressive Christianity from mainstream Christianity now. Is progressive Christianity is starting to challenge the doctrine of hell in particular, and the inerrancy of the Bible. And like this is, you started your blog in like 2015.
Yeah,
Is that
16,
what
I
you said?
think. 16, yeah.
16.
Yeah.
I I have noticed in just the last 2 years, and you probably have too, now that you're like plugged into this segment of the world, that not only is the popularity of the message that you should deconstruction is a process that will help you understand your faith better. That message is actually out there now.
Yeah.
Well-known people are deconstructing. People that Joshua Harris, for example, who
Sure.
wrote
Kiss Dating
I
Goodbye.
Kissed Dating Goodbye, very publicly went through that process and is trying to make amends for his sins. There is a huge resurgence, and it's happened ever since COVID specifically. The resurgence kind of ramped up over what it had been over the last, 10 or 15 years, and has really changed. Because when Rob Bell, do you remember Rob Bell releasing the book? What is it? It's about hell. It's about him questioning hell, but I can't remember.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
was he was written off, and just he could have been burned at the stake. People were so upset at him for it.
Yes.
But now there are probably 15 well-known popular authors writing books about that all the time, and it's incredible to see this change happening. And that version of Christianity is a hell of a lot better than the one I grew up with.
Yeah.
So I kind of hope that one takes off and finds even more of the core of who I think Jesus was, because it can only result of Christianity as I think Jesus created it could be. I think the only result could be good. I really do. Yeah, if Jesus was just teaching us not to be selfish, and to love our neighbors more than we love ourselves, I don't think that could have any negative consequences in the world. It's all the other bullshit that messes it up.
Yes.
I am curious to know more about. I'm curious as to how you would feel with a room full of Christians today, and trying to have these types of conversations. Is that still very difficult for you?
No, actually, and I mean, I generally that happens all the time, right? Like I'm surrounded
Yeah.
by other than work, I'm surrounded by Christians. So like
Yeah. Okay.
all my friends and family. to me are these multi-layered conversations where I know what they are thinking and I know what I'm thinking, and I'm trying to communicate to them in a way that they could actually hear what I have to say. And
Absolutely, yeah.
so a dumb example is, I have a very conservative family, and trying to explain defund the police, and I'm trying to explain, it's less about taking money away from this, but to say, hey, we know that
Yeah,
there are mental health problems, we know that there are housing issues, we know that there's all these just easy to fix uh, human needs, and if we put
right,
some money towards those, we wouldn't need the police, and like,
right, yeah,
but trying to, I'm doing it to you, I'm just saying it straight out, but I would couch that in as much
yeah,
Christianese language as I could, about caring for the poor and
right, yeah.
that kind of thing. So yeah, I have those conversations all the time. Is my point. So
Yeah, trying to trick people into being Christian. Yeah,
yes,
I know
yes,
exactly what you mean.
yeah,
I
yeah,
feel like that's like 90% of my social interaction is trying to fool people into representing their faith well.
yeah. I love it. Exactly. Yes, the ideas you say that you uphold. This is what
Yeah.
that would look like.
I've always been disheartened by the number of Christians who don't read the Bible, don't understand the Bible, and have never really picked it up.
Mm,
I don't know how you can ascribe to a belief without at least examining the basis of it. And that's,
yeah,
if I could say anything, any encouragement I can give, read the Bible,
yeah,
study the Bible. If you're a
yeah.
Christian, get in there, study it. You'll either find that you don't believe it or you'll find something a lot better than what you were told to believe.
Absolutely. And I like the way that Derek Webb talks about deconstruction.
Yeah,
It's like he says, "There's nothing to fear. Either
right.
you dig into it and you find that it's true, and that's great, or you dig into it and you find it's not true and you learn something."
Yeah,
Like I love that perspective. I think that's really good.
yeah. I watched him play a little live show the other day with Joey
Oh
on
yeah.
our, yeah,
Oh, very cool. Okay. I'm hoping to have him on someday, so we'll see if I can make that happen. So,
very
yeah.
cool.
So as we start to wrap up, then what were some of the influences for you that were positive, both during and after, like books or ideas or people that you found helpful?
I found myself always throwing myself into listening to podcasts. So
Hmm.
obviously, I ended up finding you pretty recently, but I started listening to one called Bad Christian,
Hmm.
which was three guys, including the guy that runs Pastor with No Answers. It was them going through this process in their own way, kind
Yeah.
of in a live setting. And Joey, his podcast kind of branched off from that and became just about that. It kind of seems about this one guy challenging mental health and his faith at the same time, kind of balancing those two struggles.
Right.
I found a lot of peace in seeing someone, and the reason why we're such good friends is because his depression and my depression look the same.
Mm.
So we understand each other. I know when he says he's doing okay, I know that really means, well, it's been a really shitty week, but I'm surviving.
Right.
Uh, you know, I know it. I know what that really means.
Yes.
So it's knowing that people are out there going through the same thing. That's always been a big help to me, and finding community like you have built
Mm.
has been the most important part of it all. And I don't even mean to build an echo chamber around yourself. I mean be around people who you can talk about this with. You have to be around people. If you're a Christian, you have to be around people who can be okay with you being angry at God.
Mm.
If they're not okay with that, they're probably not mature enough Christians, to be around you.
Yeah.
So you'll have to surround yourself with the right people, but don't isolate, because that's what I did, and that was my major mistake, I think, in the beginning of the process.
Mm. Wow, that's really, really good. I couldn't agree more. Like,
Yeah,
listener, you're not alone, and
right.
there are multiple communities out there. The Deconversion Anonymous is just one of them,
Yeah.
but come participate.
My most popular thing I ever wrote was called "It Gets Better: A Letter to Doubters." I think I may have sent that one to you. that one still gets a lot of hits because the SEO just works out. Where if someone is asking Google to find uh, a love letter from someone who has been through a bad breakup with God,
right.
they show up there, and that still gets a lot of hits, and it's generate a lot of emails to me.
Yeah.
People realizing, okay, this is the thing I needed to hear today, and I'm sure you're getting that with your writing too. That's there's nothing better than that feeling, for one. So I say seek out people who are going through it, send an email, send a message, get involved, and you'll find community.
Absolutely. The people that I know working in this space absolutely respond to their email. You will get someone to reach back out to you, and definitely. So, Matt, I can't tell you how cool this conversation was. I absolutely think you are living out secular grace in a way that I look up to. I hope to attain that level of grace, sir. I really appreciate it. So, thank you for sharing your story.
Well, thank you. That's quite a compliment. Thank you.
You're welcome. Final thoughts on the episode. Well, as promised, Matt is unique. He has a different perspective than almost anyone else I've ever spoken to. As I mentioned in the conversation, I think Matt is doing a much better job of being a bridge for people who are at the beginning of their deconstruction. They're still believers. And he's able to speak that language. He is able to recognize the attractive things about Jesus and his teachings and represent those in many ways better than the Christians themselves. When I started the podcast, I definitely wanted to keep touch with what it felt like to still believe and be in that early phase. But I have to be honest that over time, you lose that. Somehow Matt has kept that and is able to have those conversations. I love the quote. He says, 90% of my social interactions are trying to fool people into representing their faith well. In effect, Matt is walking out the teachings of Jesus in a way that is better than many Christians. And I think that's awesome. I was also glad to hear the connection between us on the topic of grace, that is meaningful for Matt as well. He says, I find myself with a lot more grace to give today. That's my experience as well, that being released from the restrictions of fundamentalist Christianity or Christianity in general freed me to love and care for people, whoever they are, wherever they are. Like I mentioned in the intro, I hope I didn't come in too hot on the pastor with no answers. Again, Matt was showing much more grace than I was, and it was really important for me to hear his perspective there, that Joey, who I do not know, but, who Matt very much does, loves and cares for him, Matt is able to meet Joey where he's at and is intentionally helping him walk through that. And that's just grace. I want to thank Matt for being on the podcast. I also want to thank Matt for participating in the Deconversion Anonymous Facebook group, the community that we're trying to build. He's become a really important member there. So if you're interested in meeting Matt, you can join facebook.com/groups/deconversion. You can find Matt on Pastor with No Answers and at ragingrev.com. Thank you, Matt, for being on the podcast. So, I mentioned in my conversation with Matt a loved one who was ill. This weekend, we lost my father-in-law to cancer. It happened very fast. In October, he was the picture of strength. You would never have guessed his actual age. And he rapidly lost the ability to stand up, the ability to talk, and he died late this week. I am obviously not done processing this. I loved him very much. He was incredibly gracious, incredibly giving, generous, kind, and ironically also the polar opposite of me. He was very politically and theologically conservative, and yet we were able to get along really well. And I found myself, the secular humanist, amongst all the believers, acting almost like a chaplain, trying to help the family grieve, and I will continue to do that. I'm not sure I have any more thoughts on this right now. I just knew I had to acknowledge this. He will be greatly missed by his wife, his 2 children, and his 4 grandchildren. Until next time, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. Time for the footnotes. The beat is called Waves from Mackay Beats. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can promote it on your social media. You can subscribe to it in your favorite podcast application, and you can rate and review it on podchaser.com. You can also support the podcast by clicking on the affiliate links for books on gracefulatheist.com. If you have podcast production experience and you would like to participate with the podcast, please get in touch with me. Have you gone through a faith transition and do you need to tell your story? Reach out. If you are a creator or work in the deconstruction, deconversion, or secular humanism spaces and would like to be on the podcast, just ask. If you'd like to financially support the podcast, there's links in the show notes. To find me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, you can Google deconversion, you can Google secular grace, you can send me an email, gracefulatheist@gmail.com, or you can check out the website, gracefulatheist.com. My name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. This has been The Graceful Atheist.